Today is all about a G.I. Joe named after a cold sweet treat good for a hot summer's day. A soldier with a code name meant to trick Cobra, thinking that he'll melt in the heat of battle, but truly, he's cold as ice. Yes, today is all about the infamous Ice Cream Soldier. Tom-Henry Ragan was born in Providence, Rhode Island. Ragan would later join the United States Army, specializing as a fire operations expert and a barbecue chef. With G.I. Joe, Ragan became their flamethrower commando, joining Blowtorch, Blastoff, and Charbroil as fire specialists and Roadblock as a chef. Though flamethrowers in various forms have been around since the days of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century AD, along with making appearances in the Peloponnesian Wars, Battle of Helium in 424 BC, and the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period around 919 AD of ancient China, the modern version of the flamethrower was invented by a German scientist named Richard Fiedler. From there, they grew to be proficient and pervasive on the modern battlefield during World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and up to the Vietnam War. The horrific nature of the weapon was upped when sticking agents were introduced with the invention of napalm during World War II. These were employed heavily by Allied forces in the Pacific Theater against Japanese defenses. In fact, some M3 light tanks were converted into flamethrower tanks, nicknamed Satans, and who dumped over 200,000 gallons of napalm during the Battle of Okinawa. Lots of flamethrower testing and training was conducted at Fort Benning, but the Department of Defense retired them from service in 1978, the same year the M202 Flash was rolled out, which fires the M72 incendiary rocket, followed later with the U.S. Marine Corps by the SMA. This gave the warfighter longer range, which is one of the reasons flamethrowers, by and large, were retired. A UN protocol on incendiary weapons does restrict their use, but they're not banned, they're just disallowed near civilian areas. However, we still have thermal barracks in the U.S. arsenal, like GBU-43 Moab, aka the mother of all bombs. In World War I, after liquor was banned due to prohibition, ice cream became the de facto means for boosting morale. There's even a story about the USS Lexington taking a Japanese torpedo strike, and as sailors abandoned ship, they scooped ice cream into their helmets and licked them clean before jumping into the water of the Pacific Ocean below. In World War II, the U.S. military purchased 3 265-foot-long concrete barges called BRLs, meaning Barge Refrigerated Large. They were sent to the Pacific Theater where they could make up to 500 gallons of ice cream per day and were used to increase troop morale with a little taste of home. They wanted to make a floating ice cream factory, and they even made them up in the air. It was a frenzy for the cold sweet treat, and so it makes sense that soldiers of this time might try to incorporate that phenomenon into their legend. Back to the hot side. The Russian army still uses flamethrowers, namely the TOS-1 heavy flamethrower system, used in collaboration with what the Russians call a battalion tactical group. They're used in breakthrough BTGs with a tank company, motorized rifle platoon, a sniper rifle platoon, a roving mortar, and a BM-21 MLRS, or multiple launch rocket system. And they're there in a fire support subgroup with the BM-21 Grad MLRS, UR-77 Meteorit mine-clearing charge vehicle, and this, the TOS-1 Buratino HFS, essentially a thermal barrack or vacuum bomb launcher mounted on a T-72 tank chassis. It's named after a Pinocchio-like character from Tolstoy's 1936 book, The Golden Key. But I'm digressing, let's get back to ICS. So with that in mind, it makes sense that Ice Cream Soldier hasn't been used much in G.I. Joe lore, though he still does have that barbecue chef secondary MOS. That's something he'd have picked up from what's now the Joint Culinary Center of Excellence at Fort Lee. This would have been even prior to the formation of ACES, back when it was split as the Directorate of Food Service, U.S. Army Troop Support Agency, and the Subsistence and Food Service Department, U.S. Army Quartermaster, Center, and School. We could also say that mostly these days he's using his fire operations skills defensively, more like a 12M MOS firefighter. This means he'd likely have gone to the Army Fire School at Fort Rucker or through the Fire Protection Training Division in Illinois that was training on Chief Warrant Officer Lewis F. Garland's guidelines. Around the time that G.I. Joe's ICS debuted, training was relocated to Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas due to the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. He'd have learned firefighting skills, including on land and various structures and vehicles, including airplanes and ships, along with rescue and emergency response skills, hazmat operations, and even how to manage wildfires, which would have made sense if he's blasting a tree line with his flamethrower or burning out some Cobra snipers embedded in helicopter wreckage. He'd also be familiar with the modular airborne fighting systems used with something like Wild Bill's C-130 Hercules for water bombing. Also, he'd know how to run with the crash and salvage team corpsmen on the USS Flag aircraft carrier, from prepping the crash cart to putting out jet fires to providing BLS until the medical response team could take over. I'm sure he'd be a good wheelman with the old Ameritech MACI fire trucks and the newer M1142 8x8 tactical firefighting truck, which is based on Oshkosh's Hemet M977 chassis. At least this way he has more modern use on a G.I. Joe team, even while he wears his expert marksmanship qualification badge with his flamethrower bar to make everyone else who can't qualify on it jealous. So why is Tom-Henry codenamed Ice Cream Soldier? Well, for that answer, we turn to DC Comics and a book starring a character named Sergeant Rock. Philip Mason was part of Sergeant Rock's Easy Company. He first appeared in a DC comic book series called Our Army at War with issue 85. In that issue, this new kid Phil joined Sergeant Rock's Easy Company. When things started to heat up, he immediately hit the dirt as rounds started flying. He told Sarge that he was just taking cover, that the barrage was heavy enough to melt the buttons on their uniforms. That's how the company gave him his nickname. He was afraid he'd melt, so he's the Ice Cream Soldier. Later, after they were ambushed by an Axis pillbox, some of the company were saying whether he melts down or freezes up, he's making things tougher for them. Later yet, they were ambushed by a pair of Tiger heavy tanks. Phil then stood up, feet frostbitten, and he grabbed the bazooka from their missing bazooka man and landed a rocket on the ice covering the lake that the tanks were traversing, plummeting one of them into the icy depths below. Phil reloaded and landed another shot at the base of the turret on the second Tiger tank. The explosion set off the ammunition inside, and the resulting overpressure blew the turret right off, saving Easy Company. Phil would later lose his life while on point during one patrol, cut down by a German Luftwaffe pilot. Those warning shots he popped off before losing his life again saved Easy Company. Despite dying, he actually showed up later again, which confused people until Kanigher clarified that subsequent stories took place before his death and not after. Kanigher would later work with Larry Hama on Enemy Ace from the Men of War series. Couple this tale with the ice cream barge story, and you know why that became a nickname at the time. Per Ragan's file card, the codename Ice Cream Soldier is the perfect cover for him, as no one in Cobra would expect someone named Ice Cream Soldier to be more than a sweet-toothed kid with chocolate ice cream stains splattered on his fatigues. Why a terrorist organization would think the US government would deploy kids on the frontline combat is beyond me, but that's what the file card says. That changes fast, though, when he powers up his super-powered flamethrower and spits out 75-foot-long streams of flaming gasoline into their foxholes and ammo dumps. ICS is a one-man inferno who scorches snakes until they melt like hot fudge on a summer sidewalk. As the packing indicates, Tom-Henry Ragan does not identify any known living person. There is one person, the only name relatively close that Hama might have interacted with or at least would want to honor, and which also aligns with part of ICS's profile as a guy from Rutland, Vermont named Tom Fagan. Rutland, Vermont is famous for its annual Halloween parade, and this even unofficially became a crossover between Marvel and DC Comics in the 70s, with characters from both universes appearing in each other's stories. Not unlike Hasbro working with Marvel to make a character based on one from DC Comics. Close, but not close enough to say that there's a direct connection there. And as far as comic book appearances, Ice Cream Soldier did appear in 2007's 25th issue of G.I. Joe America's Elite, which was published during the World War III event. Sculpted by Paul Sorton, his first action figure was released in 1994 as part of the Battle Corps line, right at the end in the waning days of vintage A Real American Hero. He came in bright garish orange and yellow colors, complete with his armor-plated helmet and melt-proof face shield that's reminiscent of those worn by the Empire's scout troopers in Star Wars. His smoke-filtered oxygen regulator, rocket launcher with flamethrower attachment, and his trio of Molotov-designed baseball grenades, along with the throwing knife and standard-issue 9mm pistol. Ice Cream Soldier's mold was put to good use in 2002 when it was reused as the Shock Viper, Cobra's fire assault trooper, arguably a much more popular figure. Perhaps this alludes to the fact that all the ice cream in G.I. Joe were from Cobra. Stick with me on this for a moment. BN-001, who's part of Revanche Robotics' Blue Ninja Army, uses an ice cream truck as a command vehicle, as seen in issue 177. The Dreadnoks used a Mr. Zoftic ice cream truck in issue 93. Firefly takes an ice cream truck to the Collins home in issue 215. And way back in issue 18, it was Scarface who stole an ice cream truck on Coney Island in New York. The ones for G.I. Joe are things like the frozen fudgy bars and those frozen confections out of New Zealand by a company called Tip Top. Tip Top even had a contest where you had to lick down on what they called the lucky stick, where you could win any number of prizes from a figure up to an aircraft carrier. But those aren't considered ice cream though, just the Cobra stuff. So, will Ice Cream Soldiers show up again? We'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.